All right, so yes, my name's Ryan Bowie and I work with the Chiefs of Ontario. The Chiefs of Ontario, it helps facilitate discussion amongst all the First Nations in Ontario and to share information, try and provide a forum where there can be discussions across different levels of governments and First Nations peoples themselves. We take our direction from the communities. We don't set the direction ourselves at Chiefs of Ontario. We're there to support us. And I'd just like to be clear that I work for a First Nations organization, but I myself am not First Nation. Okay, and when it comes to watersheds in Ontario, we've had quite a few discussions within our internal meetings in that with First Nation representatives about watersheds and the importance for the watershed level of planning and the importance of First Nations to be actively involved in this as well. In Ontario, we have three major watersheds around the Great Lakes, Hudson's Bay, and the Nelson River. But of course, that breaks down into many more secondary and tertiary watersheds. Quite often, the watersheds have resonance with the homelands of First Nations, and clearly, whatever happens in the watershed affects everyone in those watersheds, and so there's a real strong need for discussion amongst First Nations, with federal, provincial people, with municipal governments, developers, everybody, to make sure that these areas are being managed appropriately and beneficially for everyone. So First Nations have had a real uphill battle to have their rights and their jurisdiction recognized in any kind of land use planning, watershed management approaches, any development decisions, and the like. And when it comes to water itself, First Nations felt the need around 2010 to put forth their water declaration to declare their roles, that they have direct relationships and the importance of water, to assert their laws, their traditions, and their rights to be fully involved in stewardship of the waters. This declaration has guided the work at the Chiefs of Ontario, and it has been recognized by Ontario and Canada within the context of like the Canada-Ontario Agreement on the Great Lakes as being an important aspect that guides First Nations involvement in these agreements. With the water declaration too, it should be noted that it's asking for much more than consultation. Consultation is kind of step one, and it is very important. The duty to consult and accommodate was enshrined in law and recognized by the Supreme Court in decisions like the Haidu and Teku River and following legal cases. And what it does is it puts governments the requirement on them that they have to consult with First Nations whenever their actions may impact Aboriginal and treaty rights. And further to that, they also have to accommodate those infringements on those rights. So when the duty to consult and accommodate was recognized, this was a very positive development. However, as I said, it's just a kind of a first step in recognizing the authority and jurisdiction of First Nations. The duty to consult and accommodate has often been used as something that gets checked off in policy planning and development, rather than something that necessarily leads to substantive change and beneficial change from parts of First Nations. So it can become a real problem too is when there is strong opposition from First Nations to what might be occurring. Governments can still engage, have discussions, record those consultations, make some token gestures to accommodate and legally move on with their decisions. And that's not strong enough from a First Nation perspective. So in the TRC, I'm bringing this up here because the TRC, in one of its calls to action, number 45, it takes a view of beyond the duty to consult and accommodate, and asks for a reaffirmation of the nation-to-nation relationship. The treaties are fundamental in guiding this aspect of how First Nations need to be engaged on lands and water. Treaties were there to share in governance, to share lands, to respect one another. They were not land surrenders. They were not abdications of responsibilities. And so reaffirming a nation-to-nation relationship means bringing First Nations back into a very prominent role in governing lands and resources. It also repudiates these ideas of terra nullius and doctrine of discovery, which have been front and center with these conversations with the Catholic Church and the Pope in recent times too. Have gone into these sort of papal decrees that have shaped the thinking of settlers when they came here. They also encourage adopting and implementing UNDRIP, which of course the federal government has put legislation towards that end. In the United Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples puts free, prior, and informed consent as a guiding principle. And that again is much stronger than a duty to consult and accommodate, is that it still requires yet a higher degree of consent from First Nations peoples. And of course, the treaty relationship is front and center on this, and reconciliation cannot occur without First Nations being actively involved in decisions that are affecting them and their homelands. So the governance then is not just a splitting of federalism between federal and provincial governments. It does directly involve substantively First Nations governments, Inuit and Métis as well, but in the context of Chiefs of Ontario work, we're looking at First Nations. And so we need to see First Nations fully involved with jurisdiction over freshwater management, land planning, watershed management. You need to be fully ingrained in these, and that is certainly the vision coming from First Nations in Ontario, and they demand nothing less than that. So what do First Nations need though to be effective in that role, in the stewardship role? They face significant challenges with capacity, being able to employ people, to be able to fund activities on the land, to have their communities engaged in these issues. And a lot of that comes from, of course, is funding arrangements and also the capacity of communities to be active participants in the economy. So First Nations are often put in a very difficult positions where they want stronger environmental protections, but are also in great need of economic development, and those needs are played often against First Nations, and picking battles within amongst First Nations, where governments such as the Ontario government will often play favorites, where those who will play ball with their development aspirations and ignore others who don't. And we see that playing out first and foremost, I think, right now in the Ring of Fire in the far north, which is critical for First Nations to be really at the forefront of a very collective approach to managing that development, which is already occurring. And when it comes to being involved in a lot of the environmental programs, First Nations are locked in the cycle of applying for competitive funding, where they're competing against each other once again for small pools of resources, 1 or 2 year funding, and projects end, and it's very hard to keep that knowledge base and keep an effective management program when you're working under those conditions. So we certainly need secure multi-year funding that can be counted on for very strong and deep management and involvement. And of course, governance partnerships. First Nations want to be able to communicate with each other, communicate with municipalities and conservation authorities, and be involved in partnerships, working towards common goals, so that we can all be sure that that lands and waters are well taken care of. And so I see that the capacity, the secure funding, and these government partnerships working towards the ability for First Nations to study and monitor what is occurring on the land, be able to share information amongst each other. And First Nations have different concerns when it comes to sharing information, because the information they've provided has not always been treated with respect. And so to make sure that their concerns are addressed in that environment is very important, and be involved in the analysis of this information too, that it's not just a strictly university scientific endeavor, that it does involve the communities themselves. And then certainly to be able to act to ensure proper environmental stewardship when issues are identified and arise. Anyway, so my takeaway from this is that First Nations intend to take leading roles in the active stewardship of land and waters within their homelands. And there is, there's lots of movement on deepening that involvement with federal and provincial governments. However, when it comes to watersheds in Ontario, First Nations don't have any support from the provincial government at this level, and the provincial government is, of course, very important when it comes to addressing lands and resource issues, and that is something that really needs to change. We probably would have brought that up with Rob Ford today when we invited all the candidates to come and talk to the Chiefs of Ontario today. All the candidates from the major parties showed up, but Rob Ford bailed on his commitment to come there today. So that's kind of been the relationship that we've had with the last provincial government from the get-go, and hopefully we can have better conversations going forward, and let's see what this election will bring about with that. Yeah. That's all for me for now. Thank you.